Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome you to the American Academy in Berlin. This will be a great evening. My task is primarily to give a very, very short introduction to the person who will introduce Hari. And when I said that to him, he said, well, why don't you just say that I'm Alexander Booth? But that would be kind of not accepted around here. I mean, after all, I draw some kind of, if modest, pay. So I have to work. And I should like to say that, the world is divided into two kinds of people. Those who divide the world into two kinds of people and the others. There are two kinds of poets. Poets who write poetry, and then there are poets who do something even more difficult. They not only write their own poetry, but they also translate poetry. A truly challenging task, as anybody who has ever translated anything knows. And Alexander Booth is in this last category. His newest effort is the translation of a book of poems by the winner of the 2014 German Book Prize, Lutz Seiler, and the book in Field Latin will be published as we speak here, that is in the next few days, by Seagull Books and distributed by the University of Chicago Press. And I'm saying that to all of you because you obviously want to acquire a copy, and I have just given you all the crucial information. Seagull Books, distributor, University of Chicago Press. Mr. Booth is an American who, in recent years, has lived in Rome and now in Berlin. Incidentally, he also translates from the Italian, and he just assured me that he was still doing that. Now, interviewed recently and asked, where do you live and what do you like most about it? His answer was, sad, old and slow West Berlin. Now, what do you like most about it? That it is sad, old and slow West Berlin. And then the interviewer went on and asked him, what is your favorite thing about summer? And Mr. Booth said emphatically, light. And we have experienced that tonight. Summer is coming, light is there. I totally agree with you as far as light is concerned, and maybe on a few other things. Yeah.
Good evening. Émile Zola once wrote that art is a corner of nature seen through a temperament. If this is true, I would suggest that at times there almost seems to be something of the desert seer, albeit one with a wicked and rather British sense of humor, snaking its way through Hari Kunzru's work. Something of an insistent wind, of untamable nature, of the literal and metaphorical thorns of our shared humanity. That is, whether he's writing about ex-revolutionaries, the Gnostic contours of Brooklyn, last year's killings in Paris, Brian Geisen, disaster tourism, techies in Silicon Valley, the global market, or even rock and roll. Certainly no one could accuse Hari Kunzru of shying away from difficult themes, illusion and revelation, obedience and control, utopia and utopia devouring its own tail, diaspora and exile, redemption and love. Love, which, as one of his characters says, is not nothing. It is as if there is a constant and still small voice cutting through the silence to ask, what is this world of ours from which, paraphrasing T.S. Eliot, ever more frequently the nymphs seem to have departed? What in this bewildering and, again, as one of his characters says, flickering system of signs are the connections between the being human, privacy, politics, and art? Indeed, as Hari Kunzru shall ask in tonight's Mary Ellen von der Heyden reading entitled The Lyric Eye, if I have no privacy, that is to say, no interiority, am I still human as the idea has been historically understood? Hari Kunzru was born and raised in London. He studied English at Oxford and then went on to complete an MA in philosophy and literature at the University of Warwick. For the last 8 years, he has lived in the United States. He's the author of the award-winning novels The Impressionist, Transmission, My Revolutions, and Gods Without Men. His forthcoming novel, White Tears, will be published next year. His work has been translated into 20 languages. Furthermore, his short stories and essays have appeared in diverse publications, including the New York Times, New Yorker, Guardian, London Review of Books, Granta, Book Forum, and Frieze. Apparently feeling as that were not enough, over the years he has also worked with the BBC, Sky Television, and appeared at multiple literary conferences and festivals, while also finding the time to teach at various universities, including Columbia, NYU, and Warwick, and being deputy president of the English chapter of Penn for 4 years. He has been a Guggenheim Fellow, a New York Public Library writer, Decibel Writer of the Year, and nominated one of Granta's 20 Best of Young British Novelists. And, last but not least, Hari Kunzru is a husband and a father. Esteemed members, visitors, and fellows of the Academy, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving the warmest welcome to Hari Kunzru and his reading on The Lyric Eye.
Thank you, Alexander, for that incredibly generous introduction. I now have to live up to that. And first, the thank yous. I'd obviously like to thank the von der Heyden family for making this experience possible for me and for my family. And very sincerely, I would like to thank everybody at the Academy who's made us so very welcome. And it would be very hard to name everybody. It would take a long time. But I've really felt that this is an incredibly warm institution, and I'd like to thank you for making this experience such a good one. I'd like to thank my fellow fellows who have been such good company over the last few months. And I'd like to thank my wife, Katie, who has mysteriously produced many more words during my fellowship than I have. Making this presentation is quite strange for me because I don't usually show work in an early stage. And I've been kind of working out how to go about this. I mean, what I will do tonight has the sort of character of a sketch, really. It has two parts. The first of which is a draft of something which may or may not be the opening chapter of a novel, and then a second part which I'll kind of talk through some of the themes and concerns which I might try and elaborate in that novel. I've been talking a lot already over dinner, so I'm a little bit hoarse. So as Michelle pointed out, the title of my talk is The Lyric One. That's the trouble with the sans serif font. But anyway, let's see if this thing works. I think it's possible to track the onset of middle age exactly. It's the moment when you examine your life and instead of a field of possibility opening out, an increase in scope or proliferation, you have a sense of waking from sleep or being washed up on shore, newly conscious of your surroundings. So this is where I am, you say to yourself. This is what I have become. It's when you first understand that your condition, physically, intellectually, socially, spiritually, financially, is not absolutely immutable, that what has already happened will, to a great extent, determine the rest of your story. What you've done cannot be undone, and much of what you've been putting off for later will never get done at all. Your strength and ingenuity have revealed their limits. You can see a time in the future when you will need to rest. In short, your time is a finite and dwindling resource. From this moment on, whatever you're doing, whatever joy or intensity or whirl of pleasure you may experience, you'll never shake the almost imperceptible sensation that you are travelling on a gentle downward slope into darkness. For me, this realization of mortality took place, conventionally enough, beside my sleeping wife at home in our apartment in Brooklyn. I lay awake, listening to her breathing, and wondered how I'd got there, what chain of events had led me to that overheated bedroom, to a woman who, had things turned out differently, I might never have met, or might not have recognized as the person I wanted to make a life with. It wasn't that I wished I was somewhere else. I was still in love with her. Together we had a 3-year-old daughter asleep in the next room. It was a time when the media was full of images of children displaced by war. I frequently found myself hunched over my laptop, my eyes welling with tears. If circumstances changed, would I be able to protect my family? Would I scale the fence with little Nina on my shoulders? Would I keep hold of Noah's hand as the rubber boat overturned? My happiness was beautiful and fragile, and one day I would die. I knew that in most respects I had nothing to complain about. I lived in one of the great cities of the world. Apart from a few minor ailments, I was physically healthy, and I was loved. So I was protected from some of the more destructive consequences of a so-called midlife crisis. I had friends who, without warning, had embarked on ludicrous sexual affairs, or in one case developed a ruinous crack habit that he kept hidden from everyone until he was arrested at 3 a.m. in Elizabeth, New Jersey, smoking behind the wheel of his parked car. I was not about to fuck the nanny or gamble away our savings, but at the same time I felt there was something profoundly but subtly wrong. Some question that I urgently had to answer that concerned me in isolation and couldn't be solved by waking Noor or going on the internet or padding barefoot into the bathroom and swallowing a sleeping pill. It concerned the foundation for things I'd spent much of my working life writing and thinking about, the claims I made for myself and my role in the world. And coincidentally or not, it arrived at a time when I was about to go away. One reason I was awake, worrying about money and climate change and Macedonian border guards, was that an airport transfer was booked for 5 a.m. I never sleep well on the night before I have to travel. I'm always nervous that I'll oversleep and miss my plane. Tired and preoccupied, I arrived in Berlin the next day to begin a 3-month residency at the Deuter Institute, out in the far western suburb of Wannsee. It was just after New Year, and the wheels of the taxi crunched down the driveway over a thin crust of snow. As I caught my first glimpse of the villa emerging from behind a curtain of white frosted pines, it seemed like the precise objective correlative of my emotional state, a place that I recognized from somewhere deep and melancholy inside myself. The house was large but unremarkable. A sober construction with a sharply pitched grey tiled roof and a pale facade pierced by rows of tall windows. Its only extravagance was a glass-walled modern annex that extended out from one side, an open space which seemed to be some kind of administrative centre. I paid the driver and staggered up the stairs with my bags. Before I could ring the bell, there was a buzzing sound, and the door opened onto a large, echoing hallway. I stepped through it like a prince entering some fairy tale ogre's lair. But instead of a sleeping princess, I was greeted by a smiling porter. His effusive warmth seemed at odds with the sombre surroundings. Had I had a pleasant journey? Would I like some coffee? A folder had been prepared with a key card and various administrative documents requiring my signature. I'd find mineral water and towels inside my room. If I needed anything at all, I had merely to ask. I assured him that my only desire was to wash up and take a look at my office. Of course, he said. Please allow me to help you with your cases. We took an elevator to the 3rd floor, where he showed me into a sort of luxurious garret. The space was clean and bright and modern, with pine furniture and crisp white sheets on the bed, tucked under the sloping beams of the roof. The heaters were sleek rectangular grids and the windows double glazed. In one corner was a little kitchenette with hot plates and a fridge. The door led through to a well-appointed bathroom. Despite these conveniences, the room had an austere quality that I found pleasing. It was a place to work, to contemplate. When the Institute had contacted me to offer me the fellowship, I'd immediately pictured myself as the poor poet in a 19th century painting I'd once seen on a visit to Munich. The poet sits up in bed wearing a white sleeping cap edged in gold thread, with gold-rimmed spectacles perched on his nose and a quill clamped between his jaws like a pirate's cutlass. His attic room has holes in the windows and is obviously cold since he's bundled up in an old dressing gown patched at one elbow. He's been using pages from his own work to light the fire, which has now gone out. His possessions are meagre: a hat, a coat and a stick, a candle stub in a bottle, a wash basin, a threadbare towel, a torn umbrella hanging from the ceiling. Around him books are piled on books. Flat against his raised knees he holds a manuscript, and with his free hand he makes a strange gesture, pressing thumb against forefinger. Is he scanning a verse? Crushing a bedbug? Or is it a hole, an absence? Could he be contemplating the meaninglessness of existence, nothingness, the void? The poet doesn't care about his surroundings, or if he does, he's making the best of things. He's absorbed in his artistic labour. And that's how I wanted to be, who I wanted to be, at least for a while. The Institute's full name was the Deutsche Institute for Social and Cultural Research. Its founder, an industrialist with an atypical utopian streak, had endowed it with a minor part of a fortune made during the years of the post-war economic miracle, with the vague aim of fostering what he termed the full potential of the individual human spirit. In practical terms, this meant that throughout the year, a floating population of writers and scholars were in residence at the Deuter family's old lakeside villa, catered to by a staff of librarians, cleaners, cooks, and computer technicians, all dedicated to promoting an atmosphere in which the fellows could achieve as much work as possible without being burdened by the practical aspects of daily existence. I unpacked my cases and put my toiletries in the bathroom. As I moved around, I could feel my spirits lifting. The view from my window was starkly beautiful. A snowy lawn led down to the shore of the lake, where an iron fence marked the boundary of the property. Beyond it, a few small boats, their decks sheathed in plastic covers, were tied up at a little pier. The surface of the water was grey and gelatinous, undulating rather than rippling in the light wind. When I opened the window, I could hear an eerie clinking sound, incongruously like alpine cowbells, which I realised must be the aluminium rails and ladders of the boats knocking against their moorings. I thought about some lines from Hölderlin. Die Mauern stehen sprachlos und kalt, im Winde klirren die Fahnen. The walls stand speechless and cold, the weather vanes clatter in the wind. I was pleased, even a little smug, that this line had sprung so easily to mind. It was apposite in many ways. Its presence in my consciousness, so available to be applied to the view from my window, suggested that even before I had formally begun it, my project at the Institute was already underway. My proposal had been titled The Lyric Eye. Though most of my published critical work concerned prose fiction, I decided to write about the construction of the self in lyric poetry. I wrote about the lyric as a textual technology for the organisation of affective experience and a container in which modern selfhood has come to be formulated. This sounded important and good. I quoted Madame de Staël on the difference between the self in lyric poetry and fiction. Lyric poetry is expressed in the name of the author himself. No longer is it borne by a character. Lyric poetry recounts nothing, is not confined by the succession of time, nor by the limits of place. It spreads its wings over countries and over ages. It gives duration to that sublime moment in which man raises himself above the pleasures and pains of life. I noted, along with Adorno, that lyric expression, having escaped from the weight of material existence, should evoke images of a life free from the coercion of reigning practices, of utility, of the relentless pressures of self-preservation. I agreed with Hegel that the content is not the object but the subject, the inner world, the mind that considers and feels, that instead of proceeding to action remains alone with itself as inwardness, and that therefore can take as its sole form and final aim the self-expression of subjective life. I have a friend whose relationship advice I used to take until I realised that he was a solipsist. If he told me that I ought not to have an affair, as to do so would be very destructive, it was because just then he needed someone else to say that to him. Instead of addressing whatever issue I'd raised, which could have been something completely different, he was essentially conducting an argument with himself against his current impulse to cheat on his wife. When the Institute accepted my proposal and I was forced to reread it and consider it as a piece of work that might actually have to be executed, I realised that it had precisely this character. Deep down, I had no real desire to understand how lyric poets had historically experienced their subjectivity. I wasn't that interested. It was a piece of wishfulness, an expression of my own desires, the desire to be raised above the pleasures and pains of my life, to be free from the coercions of a toddler, the relentless pressures, financial and social, of living in New York. I wanted to remain alone with myself as inwardness. I wanted, in short, to take a break. Nor had not been thrilled at the idea that I'd spend so long away in sublime contemplation of my expressive self, but she loved me and was intuitive enough to understand, perhaps even before I did, that something was wrong and that the fellowship might set it right. Her mother was going to come for a few weeks. The generous stipend would pay for some additional childcare. We agreed that I owed her, and that at some point in the future she would be free to take off and do something similar while I looked after the family. I showered and changed and took the elevator down to the lobby. I knocked on the glass door of the porter's lodge and asked to be shown to my office. The jovial porter walked me through a large reception room hung with abstract paintings, descendants of the kind of work that used to be exhibited in West Berlin as evidence of American vigour and creative liberty. We passed a dining room with French windows giving out onto a snow-covered terrace. Beyond the dining room was a glass door which led to the annex I'd seen from the taxi, a large open space with desks and filing cabinets arranged in little clusters, atolls of wood and metal on a sea of blue carpet tile. I assumed this was where the administrative staff worked, so I was surprised when the porter tapped his keycard on the door and gestured for me to step inside. The room was a glass box, supported by a metal frame, the kind of unornamented space that international-style architects used to build to signify their seriousness. He consulted a little chart and showed me to one of the desks. "Here," he said, "you'll find everything you need." I told him I didn't understand. "Your workstation. You have a fast internet connection. The password is in your welcome pack. If you need the use of a computer, it will be the pleasure of the IT department to supply you with one. The small key gives you access to a storeroom where you will find printer paper and other supplies, pens and files and so weiter." He demonstrated the task light, which switched on and off with a wave of the hand. I looked around at the other desks, some of them clean and bare, others with the telltale signs of regular occupation. Books and papers, family photos, coffee cups. A line of small plastic anime figures marched along the top of a monitor. A stack of wire in trays was decorated with a sort of bunting made of coloured paper. I don't know what I'd expected, an oak-panelled library, an airy pod, but the one constant to all my fantasies about my working life at the Institute had been privacy, seclusion and a lockable door. The porter must have noticed my look of consternation, but he misread it. "Most of your colleagues are away right now, and of course it's the weekend. The place is much more friendly when everybody's here." Friendly. Also, the chair can be altered to your preferences. Some people have problems at first, but it's very easy. He bent down and began to show me how to raise and lower the seat, how to make the back recline or prevent it from doing so, how to adjust the armrests. "I'm sorry, I can't work here." "Why so?" "I need to be alone." He looked blank. "It will be impossible for me to concentrate." His blank look crumbled into one of intense sympathy, as if I just announced that I'd been bereaved or diagnosed with a serious illness. "Please don't worry, it's always 100% quiet. The rules are very clear. It's strictly forbidden to talk. The atmosphere is like a library. If people must make phone calls or meetings, there is another space. But I realised I was embarrassed by what I was trying to say. When I was younger, I'd worked in many public places, university libraries, even coffee shops. The question of noise wasn't at the heart of the creeping horror I felt at the idea of this open-plan office. The desk I'd been assigned was in the middle of the room. As I wrote, people would be moving around behind me, out of my view. Other workstations, the Porter's neologism stuck in my mind, were located nearby in positions where I'd be able to see their occupants' screens. My own screen would be visible to others, perhaps not close enough to read a piece of text, but certainly close enough to judge whether it displayed a Word document or a video playing on a social media site. I myself would be visible from every angle. My body, my posture. I have a visceral dislike of being watched while I write. Not just because the content might be private, but because all the things one does while writing that are not actually writing, stretching, looking out into space, browsing the internet, seem somehow shameful if they're monitored by others. The feeling of being watched induces a self-consciousness that I find intolerable. Somewhere in such as being and nothingness, the writer imagines himself as a peeping Tom, looking through a keyhole in a darkened corridor, terrified by the sudden possibility that he'll be caught, that the other, that importantly capitalized philosophical personage, will shine a flashlight on him and reveal his shame. While he feels he's unobserved, his entire being is focused on what he's doing. He's a pure consciousness, existentially free. As soon as there's even the possibility of being observed, a rustling sound, a footstep, or the slight movement of a curtain, all his freedom vanishes. Shame, he writes, is shame of self. It's the recognition that I am indeed that object which the other is looking at and judging. I can be ashamed only as my freedom escapes me in order to become a given object. I am in a world which the other has made alien to me. I knew that many, even most people, had working lives that included this kind of alienating surveillance as a matter of course. The police function of the open plan office is not news to anyone who's worked in one. At the bottom end of the scale, the intensity is much higher. In a call centre or at a shipping warehouse, bathroom breaks are monitored, work rate is quantified, and penalties are imposed on those who fall behind. But none of this applied to me. I was a scholar who had won a prestigious competitive fellowship. An uncommon level of self-motivation was surely taken for granted. I certainly didn't need to be nudged or pushed along by the other. The workstation was a kind of insult, a lowering of my status. It was absolutely unacceptable. I told the porter that under no circumstances would I ever write in that space. I would speak to the program manager when she came in on Monday and tell her as much. My room was very comfortable and I would be perfectly happy to work in there. He looked uneasy. Of course, you must do as you wish, but he trailed off unhappily. Perhaps I can refer you to the statement of principle in the handbook, which you will find in your welcome pack. Herr Deuter's philosophy is made clear. Something about the phrase made me furious. I wanted to tell him that I didn't give a damn about Herr Deuter's philosophy, that no one was going to make me work in some panoptical hellhole, and if he thought otherwise, well, he had another thing coming. I could feel myself becoming hysterical. I struggled to control my temper and assured him with exaggerated formality that I'd be sure to consult the welcome pack once I'd eaten dinner. At the mention of food, he brightened up and told me that a light supper had been prepared for me in the dining room. I sat down in stately isolation at the head of one of the long tables and ate salad and cold cuts under the eye of the founder, whose faintly expressionist portrait hung high on the wall. He was a lean, clean-shaven man with a prominent forehead and dark hair with streaks of grey at the temples, his arms folded over the wide lapels of a double-breasted jacket. The picture had none of the macho colossus bestriding the globe quality that most business people require when commissioning representations of themselves. His expression was pensive, even slightly uncertain. He looked sideways out of the frame instead of meeting the viewer's eye. It could have been the portrait of a writer. Somehow the picture made the idea of its subject possessing a philosophy less pompous and absurd than before. Later in my room I lay on my bed and looked at the handbook. There were colour pictures of the house and grounds and portraits of a few distinguished past fellows, a middle-brow novelist, a famous painter whose work I now realised hung in the reception room. The brochure was illustrated with a lot of boilerplate text about Deuter's commitment to the values and ideals of openness, free markets, and the sacredness of individual choice. In Deuter's biography, which took up several pages, among familiar details about his difficult war years and the post-war growth of his conglomerate, was something I hadn't previously known. In 1977, during the so-called German autumn, he'd been sitting on the terrace of the villa reading a newspaper when a young Red Army faction terrorist who gained entry by pretending to be delivering flowers forced her way past the housekeeper and shot him 3 times with a handgun. Deuter, the class enemy, was hit in the leg and stomach and spent several months in hospital. According to the handbook, he never fully recovered his health, and his death in 1985 was hastened by the injuries. According to the handbook, Herr Deuter's encounter with terror only reinforced his sense that the royal road to the future lay in the values of openness and transparency. The Deuter Institute was conceived, according to the anonymous copywriter, as a microcosm of the wider public sphere. Scholars at the Institute contribute to the development of their own public space, providing open access to their decision-making and research processes, sharing time and resources, negotiating among themselves and pooling their thoughts in the public labour of scholarship. The Institute is thus a utopian experimental community as well as a world-class centre of excellence. I assumed that I must have already read something to this effect, but had not registered the Institute's radical ambitions. I'd mainly been focused on the offer of free accommodation and a stipend. I did not understand why my participation in the public sphere, microcosmic or otherwise, had to take place in that awful open-plan office. I Skyped Noor to tell her that I'd arrived safely. "How is it?" she asked. "Fine, a little weird." "Have you met any of the other fellows?" "Not yet. They're all away. I don't mind. I'm not really here to socialise." So that is the beginning of something.